It was supposed to be their forever home, their polygamous paradise, a sprawling homestead where 4 families could finally put down roots together under the wide open skies of Arizona. We saw the drawings, we heard the promises, we watched them stand on that majestic piece of land, dreaming of the life they would build on Coyote Pass. Kody Brown, with his 4 wives, Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robyn, had a vision of a united family compound. So why, after all these years, after spending nearly $1 million on the land alone, and after countless tears and arguments, is Coyote Pass still just a patch of dirt? What turned their promised land into a financial black hole and a symbol of their family's dissolution? It's a story of catastrophic financial decisions, hidden environmental traps, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what it takes to turn raw land into a home. Welcome to COCO Gossip. We dive deep into the stories you only think you know. The saga of Coyote Pass is one of the most requested and debated topics in the Sister Wives universe, and today we are going to dissect it like never before. We're bringing in the perspective of a seasoned real estate and land development expert to explain, step by step, why this dream was likely doomed from the very start. This isn't just about family drama. It's a masterclass in real estate failure. If you're ready for the exclusive theories and the shocking financial truths that the show never fully explained, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because you won't want to miss a second of this deep dive. Let's get into it. To truly understand the Coyote Pass catastrophe, you have to erase the idyllic images the family painted for themselves and for the cameras. You have to look at the property not as a backdrop for a reality show, but as a raw, undeveloped parcel of land in Coconino County, Arizona. From a developer's perspective, the moment the Browns signed that purchase agreement in 2018, they weren't buying a future home. They were buying a multi-year, multi-$100,000 construction project before they could even think about building a single house. The first and most colossal hurdle, the one that seems to have completely blindsided them, is what we call the utility nightmare. Kody stood on that land and talked about his vision for one big house or 4 or 5 individual homes as if he could just call up a contractor and get started. That is a fantasy. When you buy raw land, you are not just building a house, you are building a small subdivision. You are responsible for bringing in every single essential service that people in established neighborhoods take for granted. This means water, power, and sewage. On a sprawling property like Coyote Pass, with multiple proposed home sites spread far apart, the cost for this isn't just an incidental expense. It is a monumental project-killing figure. Let's start with the most essential element, water. In a rural area like Flagstaff, you don't just turn on a tap and have city water flow out. The Browns had 2 primary options, drilling wells or installing a cistern system. Both are incredibly expensive and fraught with uncertainty. According to sources and local contractor estimates in that region, drilling a single water well can cost anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000, and that's just the start. The final price depends entirely on how deep you have to drill to hit a reliable water source, and there is absolutely no guarantee of success. You could spend $30,000 drilling a hole that comes up dry, and you've just thrown that money away. For a property intended to support at least 4 large families, they would likely need multiple wells to provide adequate water pressure and volume, or one incredibly productive and therefore incredibly expensive commercial-grade well. Let's imagine they got lucky and found water. They would then need to install pumps, pressure tanks, and run thousands of feet of underground water lines to each individual home site. This isn't a simple plumbing job, it's a major infrastructure project. Now, reports from individuals familiar with the family's early planning stages suggest that Kody was operating under the assumption that a single shared well would be sufficient and relatively inexpensive. The number that was allegedly thrown around in their initial informal discussions was somewhere in the neighborhood of $15,000 for the whole project. This figure is so wildly optimistic it borders on delusion. It fails to account for the geological surveys needed beforehand, the sheer depth required in that part of Arizona, and the extensive network of pipes required to service multiple lots. This is a classic mistake made by amateur developers. They hear a single number from one part of the project and fail to comprehend the massive scope of the entire system. The alternative to wells is a cistern system, And this is where the situation at Coyote Pass becomes even more complicated. A cistern is essentially a massive underground storage tank that holds water delivered by a truck. The family has mentioned a cistern on the property, but this detail is often misunderstood by viewers. A cistern isn't a source of water, it's just a holding container. You have to pay to have water hauled to your property forever. In an area prone to drought, the cost of water delivery can fluctuate wildly. We're talking about hundreds of dollars per truckload, and a single-family home can use a truckload of water surprisingly quickly, let alone 4 or 5 families. Furthermore, the infrastructure for a cistern system is still incredibly expensive. You need to excavate a massive hole, purchase and install a tank that can cost $10,000 to $20,000 itself, and then install the same complex system of pumps and underground lines to get the water from that central tank to each house. One of the most critical details that seems to have been glossed over is the existence of a single large cistern on the property. Insider theories suggest this was part of the initial purchase, a remnant from the previous owner's plans, and the Browns mistakenly believed the single cistern was the solution to all their water problems. They allegedly saw an existing piece of infrastructure and thought, "Great, the water is handled." What they failed to grasp is that this one cistern, while useful, was likely intended for a single dwelling, not a multi-home compound. To service 4 large homes, they would need a cistern of a truly colossal size, likely in the range of 10,000 to 20,000 gallons, and a complex engineered distribution system to ensure adequate pressure at each home site. Moreover, relying on hauled water for a large polygamous family with numerous children is a logistical and financial nightmare. You are perpetually at the mercy of your water delivery company's schedule and pricing. It introduces a permanent, significant monthly bill that never goes away. An expert looking at this setup would immediately conclude that unless a reliable well could be established, the long-term viability of the project was questionable from day one based on the water situation alone. The cost to install the necessary infrastructure for either a well or a comprehensive cistern system capable of supporting 4 to 5 homes would realistically be in the range of $100,000 to $150,000. And that's before they've even run a single pipe to a single foundation. Next, let's talk about electricity. Again, on raw land, there isn't a convenient power pole on your curb. You have to pay the local utility company to bring power to your property line, and then you have to pay an electrician and contractor to trench and run that power to each individual home site. The cost of this is calculated by the foot. The farther your home site is from the main road, the more astronomically expensive it becomes. Looking at the proposed layout of Coyote Pass, with lots spread out across a large acreage, we are talking about thousands upon thousands of feet of trenching and electrical conduit. Each house would need its own connection, its own meter, and potentially its own transformer. Estimates from utility providers in similar rural areas suggest that bringing power from the main line to a property and then distributing it to multiple sites can easily run from $75,000 to over $150,000. There are whispers from behind the scenes that the family received a preliminary paper napkin quote that was shockingly low, allegedly because it only accounted for bringing power to a single point on the edge of the property. They celebrated this initial low number, not understanding that this was just for the first step. The truly massive expense was the secondary distribution, the trenching and wiring across their own land to the separate home sites. This is a critical failure in due diligence. A developer would have obtained a formal, detailed estimate from the utility company for the full scope of the project, not just a verbal estimate for a fraction of it. This financial shock, when the real numbers came in, was reportedly a major source of conflict and a significant contributor to the project's stagnation. They were facing a 6-figure bill for electricity alone, a cost no single family member could shoulder, and one that required a level of financial unity they simply did not possess. Finally, we come to the least glamorous but most essential utility, sewage. In the city, this is handled by the municipal sewer system. On Coyote Pass, each home would require its own individual septic system. A septic system isn't just a tank you bury in the ground. It's a complex engineered drainage system that has to be designed based on the soil conditions of the specific location where it's being installed. This requires what's known as a perk test, or percolation test, to determine how quickly the soil absorbs water. If the soil is too dense, like heavy clay, or too porous, like gravel, a standard septic system might not be approved by the county health department. You might be required to install a much more complex and expensive engineered system, sometimes costing 2 to 3 times as much as a standard system. For Coyote Pass, this meant that each of the 4 or 5 proposed lots needed to undergo its own separate perk tests. There was no guarantee that every lot would even be suitable for a septic system. It's entirely possible that 1 or 2 of the lots would have failed the test, rendering them unbuildable without an incredibly expensive alternative wastewater treatment system. The cost for a standard septic system installation in that area can range from $15,000 to $25,000. An engineered system can easily jump to $40,000 or $50,000. For 4 homes, they were looking at a baseline cost of $60,000 to $100,000 for sewage treatment, with the potential for that number to skyrocket if they encountered poor soil conditions. On any of an exclusive theory that has circulated among close observers is that they did, in fact, encounter a significant issue with the soil on at least one of the parcels. The rumor is that one of the prime lots, a parcel with desirable views, had soil that was poorly suited for a conventional septic system. The quote for the necessary engineered system was so high that it effectively made building on that specific lot financially unfeasible for the family member it was designated for. This, in turn, created a domino effect of resentment and logistical chaos, as it threw the entire equal division of the land into question. How can the lots be considered equal if one costs $50,000 more to develop than another? When you add up these 3 essential utilities, water, electricity, and septic, you begin to see the true financial picture. A conservative best-case scenario estimate for providing these basic services to 4 homes on the Coyote Pass property would be somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000. A more realistic estimate, accounting for the challenges of the terrain and the sheer scale of the property, puts the figure closer to $400,000 or even $500,000. This is a $500,000 investment required before they could even pour the foundation for a single house. It is a staggering sum of money that the family, already stretched thin from purchasing the land and maintaining multiple households, was completely unprepared for. The dream of building their homes for a reasonable price was shattered by the harsh reality of infrastructure costs. This financial burden became an anchor that dragged the entire project to a grinding halt, creating divisions and resentments that the family's already fragile structure could not withstand. The utility nightmare wasn't just a hurdle, it was the first and arguably the most significant nail in the Coyote Pass coffin. But the financial bleeding didn't stop with the utilities. As if a potential $500,000 infrastructure bill wasn't enough, Coyote Pass held another secret, a hidden environmental landmine that had the potential to halt construction indefinitely and add layers of bureaucratic red tape that could strangle any development project. I'm talking about the prairie dogs. On the surface, the presence of a prairie dog colony might seem like a quaint, rustic feature of their new rural life. However, in Coconino County, Arizona, and much of the American West, prairie dogs are not just cute critters, they are a protected species and, more alarmingly, a known carrier for the fleas that transmit the bubonic plague. This isn't some historical footnote from the Middle Ages. The plague is a very real and present public health concern in that region. The discovery of an active prairie dog colony on a property slated for development triggers a cascade of environmental regulations and potential building moratoriums. From a real estate expert's perspective, the presence of prairie dogs is a massive red flag that should have been identified and thoroughly investigated during the due diligence period before the land was ever purchased. Any competent buyer's agent or land consultant would have flagged this immediately. The fact that the Brown family seemed to treat it as a minor, almost comical annoyance on the show speaks volumes about the quality of advice they were receiving, or perhaps their willingness to listen to it. An report from someone familiar with the property's history suggests that the seller did, in fact, disclose the presence of the prairie dog colony in the paperwork, but its significance was either downplayed or completely misunderstood by the Browns. They were so caught up in the emotional vision of their family compound that they overlooked a critical detail that could, and likely did, become a logistical and legal nightmare. Here's how the plague problem actually works in a development scenario. When you have an active prairie dog town on your land, you can't just bulldoze it. Arizona Game and Fish Department has specific protocols and regulations regarding the handling of these animals. In many cases, developers are required to hire a professional biologist to conduct a formal survey of the colony, to map its boundaries and estimate the population. This survey alone can cost thousands of dollars. Once the survey is complete, a mitigation plan must be developed and approved by the state. This often involves a lengthy and expensive relocation process. You have to hire specialized wildlife management companies to trap the prairie dogs and move them to a suitable pre-approved habitat. This is a delicate, time-consuming, and very costly operation. We're talking about a potential expense of tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the size of the colony. However, the real project killer isn't just the cost of relocation, it's the timeline and the uncertainty. The trapping and relocation process can only be done at certain times of the year to ensure the animal's survival. If you miss that window, you could be forced to wait an entire year before you can touch that section of your property. For a family anxious to build, a year-long delay can be devastating, both financially and emotionally, but the danger goes deeper. If the county health department determines that the prairie dogs on the property are carrying plague-infested fleas, they can enact a quarantine on the land. This means all construction activity is halted. No one is allowed to disturb the burrows for fear of releasing infected fleas into the air. The property would need to be treated by licensed pest control experts, a process that involves dusting the burrows with insecticide. This process itself is subject to environmental regulations and can take months to complete and be certified as safe. There is a compelling theory, pieced together from comments made on the show and whispers from the Flagstaff community, that the Browns ran headfirst into this bureaucratic wall. The theory goes that when they finally started to get serious about breaking ground, they were informed by the county that they could not proceed with any grading or excavation until the prairie dog situation was fully resolved. This would have been a shocking and infuriating roadblock for Kody. It's not a simple matter of filling in some holes. It's a legal and environmental issue that involves state and county agencies, biologists, and specialized contractors. The family was likely presented with a list of required steps: the survey, the mitigation plan, the potential for plague testing and abatement, and a corresponding price tag that could have easily climbed into the $50,000 to $100,000 range. Imagine the family dynamics at that moment. They are already reeling from the astronomical utility quotes. They are financially and emotionally tapped out. And now a government agency is telling them they have to spend another $100,000 and wait perhaps a year or more to deal with a bunch of rodents before they can even start the $500,000 utility installation. It would have been a breaking point. This is where the narrative of personal choice and family arguments intersects with the cold, hard facts of land development regulations. The arguments we saw on screen about who would get which lot and when to start building were likely downstream effects of these much larger, more terrifying financial and logistical problems. The prairie dog plague problem wasn't just another unexpected expense, it was a symbol of their entire predicament. They had purchased a piece of land without truly understanding the complexities and liabilities that came with it. They saw open space and pretty views, while a developer would have seen expensive environmental mitigation, potential construction moratoriums, and significant delays. This single issue, which they initially brushed off, had the power to derail their entire dream, and according to insiders, it played a significant role in the psychological and financial paralysis that gripped the family and left Coyote Pass a barren monument to their ill-fated ambitions. The prairie dogs weren't just living on the land. In a very real way, they held the deed. Compounding the utility nightmare and the environmental landmine of the prairie dogs was a third, and perhaps the most strategically disastrous mistake the Browns made. It was a decision that took a difficult financial situation and made it logistically impossible, creating a trap from which they could not escape. This was the decision to subdivide the property, to split the land into multiple individually deeded parcels before a single shovel of dirt had been turned for the shared infrastructure. From a real estate and development perspective, this was a catastrophic amateur move that fundamentally doomed the project's viability as a joint family effort. By drawing lines on a map and legally recording them as separate lots for Mary, Janelle, Christine, Robyn, and Kody, they created a logistical and financial prisoner's dilemma. No single person could afford to develop their lot alone, but the very act of splitting the property made a unified joint effort nearly impossible. To understand why this was such a fatal error, you have to understand how land development is financed and executed. When a developer builds a subdivision, they operate under a master plan. They secure financing for the entire infrastructure project first: the roads, the water, the power, the sewer. This work is all done at once, creating economies of scale. It is far cheaper to trench for water, power, and data lines all at the same time than to do it piecemeal. Once this shared infrastructure is in place and the lots are pad-ready, they can then be sold or built upon individually. The key is that the foundational investment is made collectively, for the benefit of the whole. The Browns did the exact opposite. They legally separated the land first. This single act had a cascade of devastating consequences. First, it created an immediate financing nightmare. A bank is highly unlikely to approve a construction loan to build a house on a piece of raw land with no access to utilities. An appraiser would deem the lot to have very little value, as it's not currently buildable. So when Christine, for example, wanted to build her house, she couldn't just go to a bank and get a loan for the construction. The bank would ask, where is the water? Where is the power? Where is the septic approval? Since none of that was in place, her individual lot was essentially worthless from a lender's perspective. The only way to get the utilities was to pay for the massive shared infrastructure project out of pocket. But who was going to pay for that? Was Christine supposed to foot the $500,000 bill to bring utilities to the entire property, an investment that would directly increase the value of everyone else's land, including Kody's and Robyn's? Of course not. This created a standoff. No one wife could afford the infrastructure on her own, and it was unfair to expect one to pay for everyone. The only logical solution was for the entire family to pool their money into a central fund to pay for the infrastructure as a joint venture. However, their history of a shared family pot was already fraught with tension and a lack of transparency. With the family structure beginning to crumble, the level of trust required for a $500,000 joint investment simply wasn't there. Furthermore, by legally dividing the land, they had created separate assets. This wasn't one family building a home anymore. It was 4 or 5 separate legal entities, each with its own financial interests. This is where the insider reports paint a very telling picture. Sources suggest that the initial agreement to fund the infrastructure was a loose verbal understanding. The assumption was that everyone would contribute their share when the time came. But as soon as the financial reality of the utility costs and the prairie dog problem became clear, that verbal agreement evaporated. The sheer scale of the required investment was terrifying. Then the family dynamics began to sour. Christine, feeling disenfranchised and unheard, was certainly not going to pour her life savings into an infrastructure project that would primarily benefit Kody and Robyn, on whose lot the largest home was planned. Janelle, ever the pragmatist, was likely hesitant to invest heavily until a concrete, legally binding plan was in place, something the family seemed incapable of creating. Mary was emotionally and physically distant from the rest of the family, and her financial commitment was always in question. The act of subdividing the land gave each wife the legal power to say no. If it had remained one large parcel owned by the entire family entity, they would have been forced to act as a collective. But by creating individual lots, they gave each person a veto. And in a family plagued by dysfunction and mistrust, those vetoes were inevitably used. The decision to move Janelle onto the property in an RV was a desperate, last-ditch attempt to force the issue, a way of trying to establish a foothold and create momentum. But it was a futile gesture. Parking an RV on a plot of land does not magically solve a $500,000 infrastructure problem or a $100,000 environmental mitigation issue. It was a temporary solution that only highlighted the permanence of their larger problems. An expert land use consultant would have given them starkly different advice at the very beginning. They would have advised them to keep the property as a single parcel under a family LLC or trust. They would have worked with them to create a master plan for the infrastructure and a legally binding joint venture agreement that detailed exactly how the costs would be shared and how the lots would be assigned after the infrastructure was complete. This would have allowed them to seek financing for the infrastructure project as a single entity, which is far more attractive to lenders. By taking the shortcut, by focusing on the emotional satisfaction of each wife having her own piece of land on paper, they skipped the most critical step. They built a house of cards on a foundation of sand. The result is the stalemate we see today. The property is a collection of individually owned, unbuildable, and therefore virtually worthless lots. No one wife can sell her lot to an outsider, because who would buy a piece of land with no utilities, surrounded by a dysfunctional family with a potential plague problem? The only person who would want to buy Christine's lot, for example, is another family member. This creates an internal market with no external value. The land is effectively held hostage by its own dysfunctional ownership structure. The divided land trap was the final fatal blow. The utility cost created the financial barrier, the prairie dogs created the regulatory barrier, but the subdivision of the land created the logistical and legal barrier that ensured they could never overcome the first two. Until one person, or one single unified entity, owns all the parcels and has the capital to develop the infrastructure for the entire property at once, Coyote Pass will remain exactly what it is today: a desolate patch of dirt, a monument to a dream that was dead on arrival. We have laid out the foundational, catastrophic mistakes that turned the Coyote Pass stream into a quagmire. We've exposed the $500,000 utility nightmare they were completely unprepared for, the hidden environmental landmine of the prairie dog plague that could have shut down construction for years, and the strategically fatal decision to subdivide the land, creating a logistical trap that made a unified effort impossible. These three pillars of failure would have been enough to sink any project. But the story of this real estate disaster goes even deeper. The problems we've discussed so far are the what. Now, we must dissect the why. Why were they so unprepared? Where was the money supposed to come from? And how did their own internal power struggles and competing visions provide the final fatal blows to an already dying dream? This is where the story moves from simple incompetence to a Shakespearean tragedy of financial mismanagement, broken promises, and delusional planning. The seeds of Coyote Pass's failure were not just in the soil of Arizona, but in the fractured financial and emotional landscape of the Brown family itself. Let's begin with the money. It's the question that underlies everything. How did they ever expect to pay for this? The purchase of the land itself, for over $800,000, was a massive capital outlay. This money was supposed to come from the sale of their 4 homes in the Las Vegas cul-de-sac. This was their seed capital, the war chest that was meant to fund the new polygamous paradise. But the execution of this plan was a masterclass in financial self-sabotage. Instead of a coordinated strategic liquidation of their assets, they engaged in a staggered, chaotic selling process that crippled their cash flow and left them bleeding money for years. A competent real estate advisor would have insisted on a clear plan, secure buyers for all 4 homes before making a move, ensuring the capital was in hand before the expenses in Flagstaff began to mount. The Browns did the opposite. They moved to a new, more expensive city before their primary assets were sold. This created an immediate and catastrophic financial hemorrhage. For a significant period, they were paying mortgages on multiple unsold homes in Las Vegas while simultaneously paying exorbitant rents for multiple homes in Flagstaff. The most glaring example of this, and a major source of contention within the family and the fan base, was the rental situation for Kody and Robyn. While other family members were in more modest, and in Janelle's case, temporary situations, Kody and Robyn moved into a large, luxurious rental home that reportedly cost them upwards of $6,000 a month. Over the course of a year, that's over $70,000. Over 2 years, it's nearly $150,000. That is money that was not just being spent, it was being vaporized. It was not building equity. It was not going into a development fund for Coyote Pass. It was being poured directly into a landlord's pocket. This single financial decision speaks volumes. An exclusive theory that circulates among those who have closely followed the family's finances is that this was the first clear sign that the collective dream of Coyote Pass was already secondary to the comfort and desires of the family's de facto primary couple. The money that could have been earmarked for the crucial first steps of development, for the surveys, the engineering plans, the initial utility deposits, was instead being used to maintain a high standard of living for one branch of the family. While Janelle was living in an RV, trying to force progress on the barren land, a significant portion of the family's potential development capital was funding a sprawling rental home just a few miles away. This created a deep and understandable well of resentment. How can you ask a family to pool its resources for a shared, difficult project when those resources are so clearly being distributed unequally in the present? The financial discipline required for a massive development project was non-existent. They were spending their seed capital on living expenses before they had even broken ground. When the Las Vegas homes did finally sell, it was not the clean financial windfall they had hoped for. The sales were staggered over a long period, meaning the money came in drips and drabs, not as a single powerful lump sum that could be deployed strategically. Furthermore, by the time the last home was sold, a huge portion of that equity had already been eaten away by months of mortgage payments on empty houses and the astronomical rental costs in Flagstaff. They were playing catch-up from the moment they arrived. There is a strong belief that by the time all the assets were liquidated, the amount of cash they had on hand for the Coyote Pass development was a fraction of what they had originally projected. It was certainly nowhere near the $500,000 or more required for the infrastructure. This financial mismanagement leads directly to the next layer of the Coyote Pass delusion: the ever-shifting fantastical nature of the building plans themselves. Kody's initial grandiose vision, the one he passionately pitched to his family, was for one single massive house. A polygamous mansion where each wife would have her own apartment-like wing, but they would all live under one roof, a physical manifestation of their family's supposed unity. From a developer's standpoint, this one big house idea was, to put it mildly, a logistical and financial fantasy. Building a custom home of that size and complexity, essentially a small private apartment building, is exponentially more complicated than building 4 separate, more conventional homes. You are dealing with commercial-grade HVAC and plumbing systems, complex engineering and structural requirements, and a permitting process that would be a bureaucratic nightmare. The cost per square foot for such a unique and challenging build would be astronomical. Furthermore, securing a traditional construction loan for a polygamous mansion would be next to impossible. Lenders rely on comparable sales to assess a property's value, and there are simply no comps for a home like that. It would be a highly risky, illiquid asset that most banks would refuse to touch. So, why did Kody push this idea so hard? But highly plausible theory is that the one big house was never a serious architectural proposal. It was a narrative device. It was a tool Kody used to sell the move to Flagstaff and to create a compelling storyline for the show. It was a grand romantic vision that he could use to test his wife's loyalty and to paint himself as the benevolent patriarch striving to keep his family together. When the wives, particularly Christine, pushed back, demanding the independence of their own separate homes, it allowed Kody to frame them as the ones destroying the dream, the ones failing to live up to the principle of a united family. In reality, their desire for separate homes was the only remotely practical option, yet it was spun as a rejection of his leadership. The one big house was a red herring, a dramatic cul-de-sac that wasted precious time and emotional energy, and its inevitable failure created yet another layer of resentment and division that made any future cooperation on a more realistic plan all the more difficult. This disconnect from reality becomes even more stark when we examine the now infamous arguments over the lot divisions and the pond. The pond. In the arid high desert of Arizona, where water is a precious and expensive commodity, the Browns spent countless hours arguing about the placement of a recreational pond. This wasn't a retention pond required for drainage or a cistern for water storage. This was envisioned as a leisure feature. From an expert's perspective, this is a glaring symptom of a project being driven by whimsy rather than logic. Building and maintaining a pond in that environment is a significant undertaking. It requires extensive excavation, an expensive waterproof liner, and most importantly, a constant source of water to combat evaporation. Where was this water supposed to come from? From their already overburdened and incredibly expensive water system. They were facing a potential $100,000 bill just to get drinking water to their homes, and they were simultaneously planning to use that same precious resource to fill a decorative hole in the ground. It is an almost perfect metaphor for their entire financial approach, focusing on luxury features before the most basic essential needs were met. The arguments over the pond's location were not really about the pond itself. The pond was a proxy for the real conflict, the battle for the best land, and the unequal distribution of power within the family. This brings us to the concept of the fifth lot. On the official subdivision map, there are 4 primary lots, one for each wife, but the family often talked about a fifth lot. Who was this fifth lot for? It was for Kody. This is a crucial detail. In the theology they espouse, The husband is supposed to be the head of the family, rotating between his wife's homes. He doesn't have a home of his own. The family is his home. The creation of a fifth lot for Kody was a tacit admission that this principle was dead. It was a clear signal that he envisioned a primary residence, a home base, that would almost certainly be shared with his legal and favored wife, Robyn. The most bitter and revealing fight we saw on camera was when the family tried to decide who would get which piece of land. The two most desirable lots were in the trees, offering privacy and shade. The other lots were more exposed, out in the open meadow. A fierce argument erupted when it became clear that the plan was for Robyn to get one of the prime wooded lots, and for the pond, another desirable feature, to be placed in a way that would primarily benefit her property. Christine, in particular, was vocal about the unfairness of this. She felt she was being pushed onto a less desirable lot after years of being a financial contributor to the family. This conflict was the moment the pretense of equality completely shattered. It became clear that Coyote Pass was not being designed as a compound for 4 equal partners. It was being designed around a central hub for Kody and Robyn, with the other wives as satellites in their orbit. Why would Christine or Janelle agree to pour their money into a shared infrastructure project when it was so obvious that the benefits of that project were being unequally distributed, with the best features and locations already claimed by the family's power couple? The fight over the pond and the lots was the moment that the divided land trap, which we discussed earlier, snapped shut emotionally, long before it became a legal and financial reality. It proved that the trust required for a massive joint venture was already gone. This leads us to the ultimate project killer, the one factor that underlies all the others, the human element. Even if the Browns had been gifted $1 billion, it is highly unlikely that homes would be standing on Coyote Pass today. A construction project of this magnitude is a business venture, and it requires what any successful business venture requires: a clear leader, a unified vision, a sound business plan, and a foundation of trust among the stakeholders. The Browns had none of these. Kody appointed himself CEO of the project, but he lacked the skills, the temperament, and the focus to see it through. He led by decree and emotion, not by consensus and logic. His plans shifted with his moods, from the one big house fantasy to the separate homes, with no consistent, overarching strategy. He was a chaotic leader in a situation that demanded meticulous, unwavering planning. More importantly, the stakeholders, the wives, had completely different and fundamentally incompatible visions for the project. Janelle, the pragmatist, seemed to want the most efficient, cost-effective path to getting homes built. She was willing to live in an RV, to make sacrifices, to just get it done. Christine, by this point, was seeking autonomy and an escape. She didn't want a shared polygamous compound. She wanted her own home, with enough distance from Kody and Robyn to feel a sense of peace and independence. Her vision was about building an exit ramp, not a forever home. Robyn's vision, filtered through Kody, appeared to be one of a grand family estate, a legacy property with features like a pond, plenty of room for her children, and the best location. Her vision was about establishing a comfortable dynasty. And Mary was so emotionally and relationally distant from the family that it's unclear if she had a coherent vision at all, other than a vague desire to be included. How can a single project possibly satisfy all of these competing desires? It can't. You cannot build a home that is simultaneously an efficient homestead, an independent escape, a grand estate, and a part-time afterthought. The land itself became a battleground for these irreconcilable differences. Every decision, from the placement of a road to the cost of a water line, was filtered through years of jealousy, perceived slights, and shifting alliances. The complete and utter breakdown of trust was the poison that contaminated the entire venture. No one was willing to be the first to contribute a large sum of money to a collective pot, because no one trusted that the money would be used fairly or that the others would contribute their equal share. Without that shared trust, there could be no shared investment, and without a shared investment, there could be no infrastructure, and without infrastructure, there could be no homes. It is that simple. So what could they have done differently? How could this project have been saved? A real estate expert looking at the situation from the outside would have proposed a radically different path. First, they would have advised against the move to Flagstaff until the Las Vegas homes were all sold and the cash was sitting in a bank account. Second, They would have insisted the Coyote Pass property remain as a single legal parcel owned by a professionally managed family limited liability company, or LLC. Third, they would have forced the family to sit down with an architect and a land use planner to create a single, unified master plan for the entire property, a plan that everyone agreed to and signed off on legally. This plan would include the precise location of all homes, roads, and utilities. Fourth, and most critically, they would have drafted a legally binding joint venture agreement. This document would have stipulated in painstaking detail how the infrastructure costs would be funded, the exact amount each family member was required to contribute, the timeline for those contributions, and the penalties for failing to meet those obligations. This approach removes the emotion and replaces it with a business framework. It forces everyone to put their money where their mouth is. It creates a transparent, legally enforceable structure that protects everyone's investment. It's possible that the very process of trying to create such an agreement would have exposed the family's dysfunction and halted the project before they ever spent a dime on the land, saving them from the financial ruin they ultimately experienced. They could have also explored development options like a phased build-out, where they focused all their resources on getting the infrastructure to just 1 or 2 lots, building those homes, and then using the equity from those completed homes to finance the next phase. But all of these logical, business-minded solutions require a level of cooperation, trust, and shared reality that the Brown family simply did not possess. In the end, the story of Coyote Pass is not just a real estate failure, it is a human failure. It is a monument to what happens when dreams are built on a foundation of wishful thinking rather than solid planning. The astronomical cost of utilities, the unforeseen environmental hurdles, the strategic blunder of subdividing the land, these were all massive problems, but they were merely the symptoms of a much deeper disease, a family business that was emotionally and financially bankrupt long before they ever set foot in Flagstaff. The empty acres of Coyote Pass stand as a silent testament to their catastrophic financial decisions, a physical manifestation of a family that had already divided itself long before they drew the property lines on a map. The dream wasn't just dead on arrival, it was built on a graveyard of broken promises and unrealistic expectations. So, we ask you, the viewers of COCO Gossip, what do you believe was the single fatal mistake that sealed the fate of Coyote Pass? Was it the shocking, unexpected cost of development that they failed to research? Was it the strategic nightmare they created by splitting the land too soon? Or was it the human element, the complete breakdown of trust and communication in a family that could no longer stand to be a family? Let us know your expert analysis in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the stories behind the headlines, make sure you are subscribed and have hit that notification bell. Thank you for watching.